Hello, my friends. I'm Rick, and this is your seat at the table, and we are looking at the official Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Wilderness Survival Guide by Kim Mohan. Stupid stuttering. My DSR. So, if you've already seen my video on the Dungeoneer Survival Guide, which obviously you may or may not have, but it is posted on the channel. The next book in the series, I mean, the one that was the obvious companion was the cover of the Wilderness Survival Guide. And one of the things, like I said, when I first started out, when they first started getting these books, I had been playing Dungeons and Dragons for a number of years at that point, and was experimenting and creating my own adventures, my own worlds, my own settings, and things like this. This book came out in '86. So what it did was give me a much more deeper insight into world adventure, as in travel, as in getting from the amount of adventure and material or the amount of stuff that can be done and had within a campaign, or even a session, just getting from point A to point B, getting from the quote the ubiquitous tavern to the ubiquitous dungeon. We usually just snapped our finger. We left town and here you are. And we didn't care about any of the other things in between. And the first edition, basic, and expert sets all had some stuff for random encounters. And what these random encounters were for implied was, so if it took your characters 4 days to travel from the village to the site of the whatever it was they were going to go an adventure at, what took place in those 4 days? So if we just had a random encounter, so we just roll once for one random encounter for each day. Well, maybe you've encountered this, this, and this each day, and we either dealt with it in a role-playing perspective, or we dealt with it in combat on the table, and that gave additional experience, additional opportunities for loot, and gave the world a feel of a bigger place. It was from evolutions of that kind of stuff that I started realizing that, for me personally, the world itself is a big place, and adventuring, just getting to the site of where you're going to be, it can be an adventure unto itself. And so I started taking that a little bit more serious. I started incorporating that into campaigns, and my players at the time were quite conducive to it. Some players don't like it. Some players find it inconvenient. Some players find it, I don't know, railroading or top-heavy or unnecessary. And that's fine. That's great. They're entitled to that opinion. They're entitled to that wish. If they don't want to sit at my table and play the way I envision the campaign going, then go somewhere else. My loss. In the same breath, I'm willing to accommodate them to a little bit of a point. But anyway, so for me, this perspective thing starts to roll out when I start looking at things like how does weather affect casting magic or shooting arrows? Oh, the best archer in the world would be seriously hampered and challenged by trying to shoot an arrow during a hurricane. Well, when does that happen? Well, that in and of itself can be an adventure. Your foe, your opponent for a given scenario may very well be just dealing with the damn weather itself. And I can think of dozens of different examples of that I've utilized over the years, over the decades. I mean, I had one not too many years ago. I had one adventure where the players were, part of their job was to deliver supplies from a dwarven city to several dwarven outposts, and they came up through. They got in the middle of a serious storm came up, and it knocked a bunch of trees down, and they had to. What do you do when the wind's knocking trees down around you? And then the next morning when they've recovered and they've got their team hitched back up to the wagon, and they start back down through that woodland road and discover that there's several trees that have been blown down overnight blocking the road. How do you proceed? What do you do? It's not very hard. I mean, we're just going to get out and do this. It's going to take some effort and some time. Great. It's the thinking process of that adventure. How do they problem solve or troubleshoot? How do they get past it? When they get to a point where a steep ravine had a bridge across it that was washed away by a flood the previous day, what do you do now? How do you get your equipment and your gear from one side to the other? That too is a scenario and part of the adventure, in my opinion. So when this book came out, just like the Dungeoneer Survival Guide, this one here was just full of expanded rules. So we look at the the overview of the wilderness, proficiencies, dressing for weather, effects of the environment, encumbrance and movement, food and water, all the basic expanded stuff. Mounts and beasts of burden, fatigue and exhaustion, combat rules for wilderness play, camping and campfires, medicine and first aid, vision and visibility, natural hazards in the wilderness. So, wilderness survival, what is it? Right? It goes on, from its inception, AD&D game has provided rules for both underground and above ground adventuring. The Monster Manual was released in 1977 as the first of hardbound AD&D rulebooks, includes descriptions of creatures and habits, blah, blah, blah. So, using these rules will require both the dungeon master and the players in the campaign to pay much more attention to details that before they might have disregarded or passed over lightly. Players will have to be much more explicit about exactly what equipment their characters are packing, and may have to include things in their gear that were never considered important before. A tent doesn't just appear out of thin air when it's time to set up camp. Everyone involved in the game will have to keep close track of time. No longer can one day journey be summed up by simply saying a day has passed and now you are here. When a party stops for a night, it is no longer sufficient for the dungeon master to announce, "Here comes the sun again, let's get going." Even if outdoor travel is only used as a means of getting from one significant place to the next, a trek through the wilderness is an adventure in itself. With proper attention to detail, getting there is half the fun and perhaps even more than half the fun. I marked this 30 years ago, maybe earlier than that, as a highlight whenever I had new players to explain to them why my version of a campaign has much more in it than their previous dungeon master's idea of a campaign, or even my earlier idea of a campaign might have had. So we talk about crunch, we talk about rules heavy systems, and by far the largest, heaviest rule heavy system out there for tabletop role-playing games is a Dungeons and Dragons, in part because of decades of additional rule sets and expanded rules. If you look at in the player's handbook on the concept of, or in the Dungeon Master's section on terrain, it's about a half a page or so. This expanded on that material. It's just like movement and how movement affects things in the player handbook is probably a couple paragraphs, if that. It's several pages in here, because what we're doing is we're giving a much more detailed. So if a player comes to you as the game master and goes, "Hey, how does my character do this?" or "I want to do that. Is it something I can do?" Now, having the basic rules are something you have to fire off out of your head. Having the basic mechanic rules and having utilized them for years means I have a deeper understanding of what can and can't be done. So if we're playing in a game with experienced players, and their characters attempts to do something, I have confidence when I sit there and say, "You were successful," or "You should make this roll. Toss a 20 to see if and see if your agility is sufficient to do this, or your strength is sufficient to do this." It's another thing to sit there and say, it's like being totally immersive, the idea of the theater of the mind. When you want to play the theater of the mind game, this is where everybody has a deep enough understanding of basic rule sets, or they have confidence and trust in the game master running the show to be fair and work within the basics of the rules. That way, if they go back later and say, "Well, why couldn't my character climb this wall? I have experience. I have good dexterity. I have climbing feat. Why was I unable to climb that wall? What made it so damn difficult?" But you can't play that out at the table and be immersive. So that's where, when you talk about theater of the mind takes the rules and sets them off to the side. So that's not in front of you. We're not looking and up and comparing things and checking for percentages and numbers and getting a judgment call on something. We are creating an option at the moment and trying to interact with it. And if it fails, it fails. What do we do? How do we resolve the situation? How do we get to achieve the goal we're trying to do if the first attempt fails? And we do that in character as if you are the character. That's easier said than done, especially if you have players who are not familiar with how to play. Doubly so if they're not familiar with how to play a role and present a role as if they're a thespian. And that's my opinions on that. So when we looked at the book and I looked at these things and I thought, Jesus, now I got a bit more understanding. I mean, I grew up here in the Midwest. I understand plains and I understand hills. I have no idea what seacoast, other than what I've seen on TV and read in books. I don't know shit about mountains or seacoasts or swamps or oceans because I didn't grow up around them. I didn't have to interact with them on a regular basis. Proficiencies, non-weapon proficiency, success and failure. That's another thing that's interested me over the years, because I'll get new players that come in and they'll see all these feats, all these skill options, especially the 3.5 version. They tried to tailor out a lot of that stuff in recent 4.0 and 5.0. They tried to consolidate and reduce the crunch to lighten up the rules. But they didn't understand. People go, why did they do that? Why did we have why was there such a wider range of stuff in the previous version than this current version? Well, in part because we have this stuff here. Why are there so many feats that are not combat related? They're skill related. Why do we have skills that doesn't seem like they matter much unless you're in a specific situation? Because that's the way that works. My skills in survival in the Midwest are going to be far greater than trying to survive in the mountains or on the ocean or in a deep swamp or in the deep desert, because I didn't grow up in that environment. I'm not accustomed to it. I don't have some basic understandings of what I should and shouldn't do. I'll be bopping around the plains, what kind of weather to keep an eye on, how brutal winters can be, how to prepare for stuff. What kind of rodents and critters and bears that I might bump into that's local to me. This gives those people who don't understand that stuff a little bit bigger insight. It also explains a lot of why there's so many skill sets and so many proficiencies and so many feats that do not relate directly to combat. It's because of trying to overcome and deal with and adapt to your environment. The environment can be an opposing force unto itself. And that's can be part of the fun, depending on the person and the player. So we talk, it goes into proficiency descriptions, alertness, animal handling, animal lore, blind fighting, charioting. Some of this stuff, this is the first time it shows up. Some of this is where it began. And if you go and look at the latest version that you have and you go, oh, this has been here all along. Yeah, it's been here for 35 years because it got created in this book here, or in that book there, or that first edition book there. And it then has seen a progression through the various systems as players and writers and designers and game masters have decided what's most important and what isn't most important, and what can we tone down and what do we need to ramp up. And this is how we get from there to here. So dressing for the weather. Well, we're going to go out, we're going to adventure in the high mountains. So you were just adventuring in the swamp 3 days ago. Now we're going to high adventure in the mountains. What are you going to wear? Well, I'm going to wear my metal armor. Well, let's see. How does extreme cold affect metal armor? People wearing metal armor. It talks. That's in here. Rules, effects of exertion, clothing that functions as armor, protected and unprotected characters, clothing. There's a whole section on damn near a page and a half just on clothing. So here we are, 1, 2, 3. 3 pages dealing with just the weather, the cold, dealing with the cold. And the opposite, the extreme heat. How functionable is a full suit of armor if you're in the middle of the damn desert and the temperatures are getting excess of 110 degrees every day? How good is it? How effective is it? How effective can you be when you're physically exhausting yourself just standing around in the heat? Good questions. If you want the answers to those questions, having the mechanics handy or available to you gives you that option. So once again, hurricane damage to structures. We're talking cyclones, hurricanes, typhoons, special weather, droughts, gales, mist, sandstorms, dust storms. If you've never been in a sandstorm or a dust storm, you really don't have an appreciation for what that is. And I haven't ever been in one. I've seen it on TV. I've read about it in books. Well, here's some mechanics that lets me, who've never been there, to be at least give a fairly accurate challenge to somebody who's on a table perspective who are doing it. Once again, we talk about heat and cold. You can die from heat exposure. You know this. You can die from cold. You know this. Here's the mechanics that allow you to figure that out. Here's what happens when frostbite sets into your character. Do we care about that? A lot of people, we're back to that, how deep of a level of immersion do you want for your game? Majority of people don't give a damn about frostbite and don't want to be bothered by it. Fine. But there are some people who do want to do that. And then there's the opposite side of that too. If you're the game master and you want your characters to come across somebody who's half dead from being exposed to the weather, and they're going to get possibly some valuable information or assistance or just doing a good deed, the characters are going to try to help that person. Having some basic mechanics, if you're not a medical specialist on hand to look this up, is a good thing. And yes, you can Google it now. You can Google everything. But keep in mind, this came out in '86. The Google didn't exist. The lion's share of the public didn't even have a cell phone, because most cell phones in the '80s were the size of a frickin' literally called them a brick. They were bigger than my damn cup, and they were heavy and expensive, and the service that supported them was expensive and rare. So, yeah, these rules came out for damn good reasons. In part because this was the only resource we had available unless you had an encyclopedia at home. If you had the Encyclopedia Britannica, hey, you had a lot of resources available at your fingertips. But how that information translated to game mechanics, once again, somebody did a lot of hard work and effort to create that. Can you imagine the amount of time and effort that Kim Mohan and the others that worked on this project devoted to all this stuff? This stuff is not popular. It's dry. It's factual. It can be boring as hell just to read it, which is another reason why so many people dismiss things like encumbrance and hunger and the effects of weather, because it's not fun. That's not fun to them. And that's fine. It's not necessarily supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be a freaking challenge. How do you get over it and you overcome and get past it? So encumbrance and movement for land-based animals. I'm just going to put, we just, killed that dragon, and now we got 150,000 gold pieces and silver and whatever. And we're going to pack all that up on our mule Joe over there, and he's going to haul it. Really? Yeah, let's see how well that turns out. We got the mechanics for it. Climbing. We're back to that. How did climbing work? What does it work? How does the various surfaces that you're trying to climb affect your ability to do so? How do we expand on those things? How do we go? Somebody says, I want to climb up that ice wall over there, and all I'm going to use is my fingers and this dagger. How do you do it? Well, I don't know. Let me give us a roll of 20, right? Well, if you actually want to have some mechanics and understand the concept, even if you don't apply them, here you go. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 pages. 9 pages on climbing. That's crunch. That is a heavy set of rules, right? But it tries to account for every possible scenario. Other modifiers to climbing, rating for non-thieves. Modifiers to climbing, rating for thieves. Damage from falling, which is so basic. Most of us know it by heart. Damage from tumbling down a moderate or gentle slope. There's a scene. I want to say it's The Princess Bride. Don't give me. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. And the Dread Pirate, the fellow playing the Dread Pirate Roberts, ends up tumbling and falling down an extremely steep slope for a long period of distance while he's yelling, I love you, or something like that to the girl that he's been chasing. So how would that kind of tumble really affect a person and the possibilities of getting hurt or killed doing it. Right here, right? Using rope for movement and climbing. We want to do some belaying. How do we do that? Rules on belaying. Roping together. Rappelling. Use of grappling hooks. You know, I'm just going to hook my grapple over that thing. And that's usually as much as it takes. Make a roll to see if you were successful or not. But if you want to know a bit more depth and detail, or that's more of a challenge, here's the challenge, here's the ratings, here's how to apply it. Crossing a chasm on a rope. You don't want to balance, and we're going to throw a rope here and we'll make a bridge. I'm an elf. I'll just run across it like it's a broad, wide highway. Well, I'm a heavy-set human. I'm not that dexterous. How do I do it? You know, how does the dwarf do it? Mountaineering proficiency, movement on slippery horizontal surfaces, jumping. There's a freaking page and a half just on jumping. Overland movement, reduced visibility. No, half a page on jump. Then we get into swimming, endurance and speed with swimming. Other effects of moving water, diving and surfacing, treading water, holding one's breath when not underwater. Movement in waterborne vehicles. So I've done numerous campaigns over the years where we applied it. It was either with ships or boats, barges, whatever. And people go, how do you know how that works? Well, I have a book for that. I have rules for that. I have a general idea how this thing should work, how we should handle it. The boating proficiency, portaging, the use of a capsized vessel. Then we get a whole section on flying mounts. Talk about people, they get all excited about, let's have flying horses so we can all fly around with Pegasus and we'll speed up things and we'll do things. Well, okay, great. So here's some rules. Here's how much they can carry. Some basic information we might want to know and how that works. What happens if you fall off, right? You know. Then it talks about to fall or not to fall. The character always has a chance of falling from the back of an airborne mount unless he is securely fastened. Hey, you have a chance of falling off of a land-based mount. You get on your horse and you don't know what you're doing, you can fall off and get hurt. You're killed. All right? Or maim your horse in the process. So, you know, rider's entire body, rider's lower body, rider using a saddle equipped with stirrups, etc., etc. Proficiency in airborne riding. Move on to food and water. One of the very basic concepts that's some of the first things chucked out the window. Some of the earliest magic items that came out that was designed to take care of this problem. We get this endless bowl of porridge, or the spoon that created porridge, or whatever the hell it was, for example. And then, of course, the items that you can wear that just foregoes your hunger. I always had mixed opinions on them, and most of it was not favorable. I did not care for them, in part because I felt that they were a cheat. Part of your encumbrance, part of your dealing with general living on an adventure is carrying enough rations or supplies to keep yourself fed, enough potable water to keep you hydrated, including your mounts. So many people forget, well, we got a pack of horses and a mule. Right, so how much grain and water did you plan on them having? They take a lot more than you do. How are you going to truck all that? You're going to need an extra mule just to carry that. All right, maybe 2 mules, which will then, of course, require more food and water and care. It's like the people who we're going to spend 4 days riding our expensive horses out to this dungeon, and then we're going to spend 3 days in the dungeon. So what did you do with the horses? Oh, we just tied them up to a tree outside. So for 3 days in the wilderness, outside of a known dungeon, you just left your horses? What are the chances something came along and ate them, or killed them, or stole them, or they just died from neglect? Well, we didn't think of that. That's not fun. No, it's not fun. But it's also a reality. How much reality in your immersion do you want? Because if you want to go there, we can do it, and we have the knowledge of why and how this works, you know, how things like a weakened character that hasn't been eating for a while, an incapacitated character. So Joe got clobbered over the head by that ogre, and now he's almost a vegetable, and you're not willing to abandon him here for good reason. You're going to try, and you don't have enough healing spells or potions to fix him up. So you bandage him up as best you can. And by the way, there's rules for that. And how do you progress? I mean, at this point, how does he get fed? He's unconscious for a week. He's likely to die from starvation because somehow you've got to get nourishment in him. How do you do that? How do you get him to take water if he's unconscious? You know, how do you get that water down to his belly so he stays hydrated? All right. So we talk about tolerance levels for the lack of food and all the effects thereof, going without water, effects on animals, minimum daily requirements for food, minimum daily requirements of water, foraging. Oh well, we're just going to forage as we go. We're going to pot small animals and have plenty, catch a deer, that kind of stuff. Hey, all that stuff is great. But do you have any idea how much time and effort that takes? How much of your travel time of your day is spent doing it? I've always made that argument. If you're going to do that, and I'm not adverse to it. Our rangers have skills. Our characters have sets of skills and options for skills to do that very stuff. So my philosophy was always, okay, if we're going to forage twice a day while you're traveling, you're kind of keeping a lookout. Why is one person doing all the lookout? What's everybody else doing? Well, this character might be looking for food stuff. Hey, there's a bush full of berries. Let's stop and pick some. We're going to spend an hour picking a bowl full of berries. There's some tubulars over there that are edible. Let me pause and grab 5 or 6 of them. We can boil them up in our supper for tonight. The archer might be keeping an eye out for, game that they can get. Of course, a moving party, the larger the party, the more noise and the more noticeable they are, the less animal life is going to stick around. They're not stupid either. They're going to run. So we're back to that foraging, and then how different is it to forage in the winter from foraging in the summer? This is how we know this stuff. And if we go back in the newer generations and we don't care about it, fine. But you know what? The newer generations have the benefit of the fact that all this crap existed and still exists. If you need to know, it's here. Nowadays, you just Google the shit and figure out how to adapt whatever you Google to your game. Or you can Google the material on a game site that's related to your game, and bing, bang, boom, what comes up? The stuff like this. And where do they get that stuff like this? From books like this. Hello, you little punk. So hunting, the effects of dealing with it, hunting proficiency, fishing. Oh, we're just going to fish as we go. Really? You ever tried fishing while you're riding your horses along? Yeah, good luck with that. Now, if you're in a boat and you're going upriver and you want to fish, geez, that's a no-brainer. Hello. Consuming and carrying food, the effects of tainted, spoiled food, finding water, chance of food going south, food spoilage, where water can be found, purifying it, effects of drinking it, water desert, permafrost, etc. Then we go, well, we're gonna make camp. All right, so what do you guys do? I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do this. Or we just make camp. Just traditionally, that's what we do. We're making camp for the night. We're taking a long rest. That's our answer. We're going to take a long rest. Oh, yeah? Okay. What if we make it a little bit more of an effort than that? We're immersing ourselves in this. Let's experience it, because I've been camping. I spent a lot of my youth camping, and I found that to be quite enjoyable. And some of the best times was those moments after the hectic BS of getting a camp set up, let alone pulling camp down and packing everything up. But it's all parts of it, looking for natural shelters, dealing with portable shelters, the differences between adequate and superiors, setup times. Oh, and once again, magic comes to the rescue. Oh, geez. There's a handful of magical items and artifacts and magic spells that allow you to create instant shelters, instant campsites. And in a way, that's just a way to expedite and eliminate this necessary need to do this more mundane task and this more mundane element of your adventure. If we're trying to immerse ourselves in the actual experience, this might be something that we want to do. If it's not something, it's just something that most of the players decide is a pain in the ass, well, okay, snap your finger and your long rest is over and nothing happened, and what are you going to do now? So, rest and comfort, how much to sleep, how does the effects, so we talk about the effects and lack of sleep. For the average rest per day, less than 5 hours, this is a modifier. Less than an hour sleep, you get a +5 modifier, a bunch of negative. Well, these are pluses in this game, they would be negatives in others. So if you've only had an hour's sleep in 24 hours, you're going to be weaker. Your dexterity is going to be weaker. Your strength is going to be weaker. So in this case, it says a dexterity checks at +5. Wisdom checks at +3, Constitution checks at +2, -3 to hit. Climbing rating is a -30, movement rating is a -50, weight allowance is a -100 times strength. So if you only get an hour's sleep, you're going to be weaker, more lethargic, less aware, less capable. That's what they're getting at. Good sleep versus bad sleep. Character not prone or in a relaxed position, laying on a bare ground, i.e., no bedding or padding, personal temperature below 0. You're laying on the ground with no blankets and no sleeping bag, and it's 10 below. How much sleep are you really going to get? You might get the sleep of a lifetime. All right, fire, friend and foe. Set up too small a fire and it doesn't do you any good. Set too big of a fire, it burns the whole woods down and possibly sends you running for your life because you overdid it. Not to mention the fact of precautions and perils of a large enough fire attracting attention you didn't want. Availability of fuel. How hard is it to find fuel for a fire in the middle of winter in a desert, or in the middle of summer in the desert, right? Versus the hills, mountains, plains, or swamp, right? Medicines and first aid. It's another one of those early things that most game groups do is find magical ways of healing your damage. I mean, obviously everybody wants to have a cleric in the party. The cleric can just constantly throw spells every day until you're healed up. Whenever possible, you stockpile up potions of healing. You think potions of healing, the sheer amount of potions of healing that get consumed in an average game session, let alone a game campaign, is staggering. If you look at the creation material list and what it takes to create, the amount of time, effort, and money it takes to create potions and things like this, you would almost think that this is a freaking, not a cottage industry, but an industrial industry. Somewhere, some big city, they've got a factory of alchemists just cranking this shit out by the 100-gallon ton. We're producing these things by the wine barrel full, because it's just the sheer amount of availability. Just something like every small village and thorp in existence has somebody who can sell you some damn healing potions. How convenient is that? Try being a stir. Try running a campaign where things like that are very rare. If you look at the rules for acquiring stuff like that, it actually suggests that they are. And one of the reasons why magic items cost so damn much is to make them rare. It's not that Monty Hall thing. That's a big mistake on a lot of game masters' perspective of being overly generous, of just showering the players with loot and magic items and things of that nature that should be, the whole focus of an entire adventure potentially is to acquire a single thing, to get that magic sword, right? Or to get that little, the ability to pop up that iron tower that we can all now set up every night in camp and not draw attention from from miles away from that big iron tower that suddenly appeared on the horizon that wasn't there the previous night. That spoon of never-ending porridge. I'm just saying, right? So, the ability to use those. Why does everybody have an option to have healing as a proficiency? And what good is it if you're not a magic-based healer, if you don't have the magical heal spells? This is where those rules originated from and expanded upon from. In theory, it takes longer, of course, to physically heal your body, because that's the realities of the real world. So if you take a lot of damage, physically speaking, it should take you a long time to heal. And in some aspects, in some campaigns, the reality is without magical healing, the campaign's over in the first encounter, because one of your players just took 80% of their hit points and damage, and now it's going to take them 6 weeks or 6 months to heal that all back up the hard way. You can't leave them behind, because then they're not going to live. You have to take them back to town. Now you get somebody to replace that person and go back out until the next one of you get hurt. Or we get magic and healing. So ideally, this helps you to deal with that intermediate way. It's the other thing that we're back to resource management from a game perspective. I don't know. This seems to me that it's one of those things that, like encumbrance. Nobody wants to care about encumbrance. Nobody wants to deal with it. Nobody wants to deal with too much overland adventuring and things like this. So when we talk about healing and hit points, specifically for Dungeons and Dragons, because obviously not every game system uses hit points. They have different versions. Uh, in this case, you take X amount of damage. Magically, they can cure you like this. Physically, if you got to take the actual, long route, it could take months to get all the way back to 100%. So, what kind of campaign can you have if every hit point your characters take are extremely difficult to replace? Every hit point counts. It's like every arrow counts. I got an archer and he's carrying 100 arrows. Well, it's assumed he's going to recover those arrows after combat. Well, what if you fire off 10 arrows and you roll a d10 and recover 3? You recover 3 of your arrows. Now you're down to 97 arrows. So over the progress of a period of time, your arrows break, they get lost. Well, they get consumed or damaged. You fire 6 arrows off at an opponent, and then your wizard fires a fireball off at that opponent and toasts the opponent, finishes them off. What else did he do? He finished off your arrows. Well, now that proficiency for making new arrows comes in really handy when we're sitting around the campfire at night, and your archer's over there trying to field strip a twig to turn it into to the shaft to mount that arrowhead that he was able to recover from the fireball. I'm just pointing that out. So hit points, if you apply hit points in that same manner, well, boy, that the whole campaign takes on a different light for the players, because then they're going to be a lot more cautious about just throwing themselves at every foe that comes along, because they know that those 40 hit points that they have, or those 12 hit points they have, are going to take forever to replace, because we don't have access to instant heal. Sure changed the attitude and the outlook of that particular campaign. I suggest try running a game that way. Just try running a session or two that way, and see if it does not change the mindset to everybody. If they're more consciously aware that mortality is a real possibility, and it can come through attrition, not sudden demise. Attrition, hundreds of paper cuts can still kill. Right? So we talk about first aid equipment, vision and visibility, normal vision, infravision. Oh boy, that's a huge thing today, isn't it? It seems like every other playable race has infravision. Why? Because it's convenient. It's the same reason why we wanted magic spells and magic items allow us to see in the dark. Because it's a pain in the ass to have to worry about torches and lanterns and oil. Oh my. Because that was how it was originally. You went into an underground dungeon. Either the dungeon was magically lit, or has some kind of caretakers that were going around and replacing the torches every 6 hours because it was lit by torches or whatever. Or it was pitch black. And like I've said before, lock yourself in your closet and put a paper sack over your head, and it still won't be as dark as it would be if you were actually in a cavern 20 feet down or 200 feet down. I have been in them, and I've been in them with the light turned off. You literally would not see the wall until your face hit it. The truth is, you are blind, and you're blind in a way you've never experienced. Because, kudos to people who grow up blind, who are blind. They develop their other senses and their other skills and a sense of presence. My wife's uncle is blind, and yet he knows when somebody else is in the room. He knows where everything in the room's at. He doesn't blindly bounce off a crap, and he's a bit more conscientious of that fact. Just pointing out the obvious there, right? So the fact is that a real challenge is not having the magic ability to get infravention or the built-in ability to have infravention. So the fact that your characters are going to go into a cavern or underground scenario and they got to bring torches, that's encumbrance. It costs weight and material. Plus, it's something gets used up. We're back to resource management, something else that we don't do much of. Most game groups don't want to be bothered by that. Well, we got a hooded lantern. We have 2 hooded lanterns, and we bought four vials of oil. Well, that one vial of oil is good for 24 hours of constant use. So you have 4 days of light with one lantern, or 2 days of light with 2 lanterns. Or you need to bring more damn vials of oil, more flasks of oil. And how many of them are we going to use? And if one of your guys likes to throw them at stuff and set it on fire because it's pretty and it does damage, we go through them a lot faster. Just a thought. So visibility and vision, and how that plays out. You know, you want to put your characters in a really interesting scenario. Have them fight in some thick fog. Have them have an encounter in very thick fog. We see it in the movies every now and then. Some videos, it's really a truly challenge, and especially if that fog has a tendency to thicken and lighten and thicken and lighten. So visibility might expand one round and contract the next 2 rounds. You know, I've done that. I've run encounters that way, and one of my favorite ways of dealing with that is tossing that D4 out there. So at the beginning of every round, I toss that D4. That D4 determines how many extra feet or how many extra squares your visibility extends. Now, it's much harder to do that on a 2D map when you got all your minis in front of you, but, you know, in the theater of the mind, you know, one minute you see the foe over here 10 feet away, and the next minute you can't see him at all because the fog's thickened up to where you can't see your hand in front of your face. The next minute your foe is not there at all because he's moved and you didn't see where he went. Try running that for a while. That's a challenge and a half, right? Talking about artificial illumination, the things like torches, lanterns, campfires, magic weapons, all have their endurance issues as well. Natural hazards in the wilderness, though: volcanoes, lava eruptions, ash eruptions. I was in a campaign where a guy ran it. This guy was running. The adventure basically involved in dealing with this cult that had something to do with a damn volcano. And the whole thing was built inside the volcano, and the volcano has a tendency was pending an eruption, and all the signs of the earthquakes and bubbling lava and other problems and gas bursts and things like this. And so he actually had a clock, so he set a timer, and we had I think an hour and a half on that cooking timer before the volcano was going to go off. And we didn't know when we didn't get to see the clock. He showed us the clock. He set the time, but he didn't show us how long he had set it. And then he set the clock so it faced him, and you could hear that thing clicking. You could hear it ticking. So you knew time was ticking, but we just didn't know how much time, and we didn't know, And I don't remember how that scenario ended. I don't think it ended well. All right, I'm just saying. So explosive eruptions, earthquakes, types of quakes, tidal waves, avalanches, rock falls, and mudslides. I've used these numerous times in campaigns as an encounter. Flash floods and things like that. Also natural things to deal with. Quicksand, a little bit of information on that. Combat rules for wilderness play. Fighting while climbing. Fighting while precariously balanced. How many times has your character's been up on a cliff face fighting you see it in the movies, you read it in the books. How challenging really is that? When the peril of not just your opponent potentially killing you exists, but just getting wounded and losing your balance, or just losing your balance or having a bad day. All that's a plausible thing. Now what about fighting while you're suspended? What if you are trying to descend the side of a frickin' cavern, or you're trying to climb the side of a mountain and the damn things are attacking you? Whether they're shooting arrows at you, or they're physically on the side of the mountain with you, trying to kill you or throw you off, or they're flying and trying to get you while, all that's a possibility. All that has mechanics and rules to help you guide yourself and your group through that sort of thing. Back to that fighting in the fog, fighting in poor visibility. Missile combat from a mount, forcing opponents to dismount. How do you get them to your opponents are on horses and you're not. How do you get them off the damn horses? Fatigue and exhaustion. Several pages on just this concept. something that we blow off and we ignore, and we tend to not utilize at all. And if that's not your thing, and like I said, a lot of people, this is boring to them. This isn't killing a pile of the dragon, so it's not as fun. Mounts and beasts of burden, several pages on dealing with that. You know, animals, horses don't like fire, friends. They're not keen on fast-moving water, neither. I know that for a fact, because I grew up with horses. I guarantee you that's not something you want. Also, horses can be skittish, and everything from weird sounds to strange odors can get them to be skittish. Be aware of that. And if you're not aware of that, then that's a great way for your group to have a problem. And what happens if one of your pack animals, the one that has most of your loot on it, gets freaked out by a snake and bolts? Now what do? You got to chase that damn thing down and try to catch it before it careens into a tree or off a cliff, or it takes your loot with it. You want to cheese off your characters, your players. Have that, put that scenario, have them, and they fail catching that damn donkey, and they lose most of their loot. You know, magic in the wilderness. Some of the challenges of using it. Some spells are much more creatively used in these scenarios than others. It's all in here. It's just like another argument. If you've seen the spell lists, why do they include this? And why is so many of these cantrips? And what is this useful for? When will ever use that? It's because you're not in the scenario when it comes in handy. So if you know you're in, we're back to that part of that travel and adventure. If your group, if for an example, your wizard spends his evening studying the spells he's going to use for the next day. Well, if he knows he's going to spend the next day traveling through the wilderness, that's a rocky, mountainous terrain, perhaps he's going to study some spells that will be more effective in that environment to deal with environmental problems as much as foes. Right? Just that thought. Just, is what it is. Take from it what you want. Go on and go forth. Rods, wands, potions, rings. Alright. That's another thing about certain potions. I've never done this, but I had a friend that ran a campaign, and we was fighting in Arctic conditions, and adventuring in Arctic conditions, and we had a number of potions, and he decided that certain types of potions, based on what he thought, he looked up what the suggested components were to create them, would be susceptible to being frozen. So what if your healing potion freezes solid? Can you eat it? Can you just, scoop it out of the container and eat it like an ice cream sandwich? And it still have it effective? Or do you need to thaw it out? What happens if you overthaw it? What happens if you set it too close to the fire and it starts to boil? Change the consistency of the item? Well, it's magical. Yeah, but magic's not the end all to beat all, and magic's is applicable. So you can be saying that a potion is magical, that it contains magic, and the things it will do will result in a magical transformation or a magical effect, but the substance to itself perhaps is not magical. It's how it interacts with the consumer that makes it magic. Yeah, I spent a lot of hours and a lot of debates and discussions about that sort of stuff, right? Especially when you smoke weed in your 20s. You have a lot of those in-depth thoughts on how does that exactly work. Starting from scratch, realism versus fantasy, step by step, winging it, starting from scratch, the semi-finished project, scaling down. So there's the other side, and I've made that faux pas. When I first started doing it, I overemphasized the adventure. I was so hell-bent on having the players their major encounters be the environment and minor encounters around them, just traveling from the town to the dungeon, that it became so overwhelming for the players, they got pissed. Or the group ended up having to turn back. We never got to the dungeon on one occasion. And then the other, one of my first scenarios was when we got to the dungeon, suddenly I was at a loss because I hadn't really spent any time on the dungeon itself, what they were going in, to adventure to do. And I had to learn to ad-lib on the spot, and sometimes learning to do that from the scratch can take its toll. you don't think things through as well, they're not as enjoyable to your players and yourself. You get frustrated by it pretty quick. So another concept is scaling down. So you envision this grand journey. Then at the end of the journey, there's going to be yet another major event. Well, then perhaps you need to look at all the plans and thoughts and stuff and try to shave it down, thin it out. We don't want to have one thing. We go from a hurricane to a to a drought to freezing conditions to a freaking earthquake, all in the same damn week. Jesus, somebody in that group is terrible, terrible, has a very, very bad luck, or is cursed. Now, if that's the scenario you want to play out, that can be a game session right there. If somebody got a curse on them, that affects the entire group in horrible ways until they figure out that this person is cursed and how do we get rid of the curse. So we go into the appendix, the world of weather, introduction, basic assumptions, climate regions. The just goes on. We're almost at the end of the book. Hey, come on, you hung on this long. Good for you. Special weather definitions, relative humidity, and so on, blah, 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 right? Wind chills, complied tables, and then charts for encumbrance, movement of vehicles, animals, climbing movement rates, modifiers to non-thief climbing rates. I used these charts quite a bit back in the day. They were quite, and I still use them occasionally today if I run campaigns. Last year or so, for about 18 months, I ran a river-based campaign on D&D Beyond. Airborne vehicle characteristics and stuff to determine how far the boat can move in the day. So we get into some hex maps, tiny, medium, and large. I love my hex maps. So many people today want squares, and to me that's so not natural to me. The character's sitting here to here's your right flank, your left flank, your forward facing, directly behind you, your peripheral left, peripheral right. I mean, it's just a natural thing to have a square. Well, you got your forward, you got your right, and you got right, left, and rear. And yes, you got a couple. You actually have more facings with, or more options with a square than you do a hex, but it's not as natural in my opinion. But then I spent the first 20 years of my gaming life using nothing but hexes, and it's also why it also translates from combat to or into tabletop war games. This is why BattleTech and a lot of tabletop war games still use the hex. So when the tabletop role-playing games got away from the hex, part of me believe they just did that so they could distance themselves a little bit, or to try to change things up a little bit. Now you gotta buy a whole slew of different maps because now they're based on the square instead of the octagon. Yeah, it is what it is. So that's my babble and opinion on this particular book. Till next time, I hope you guys have a great weekend, right? Yeah, where you at? There we go. Going on, my friends, this is Rick, and hey, if you like the channel, please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, tell your buddies, tell your friends, tell your coworkers, tell anybody else that's in the gaming industry or gaming fandom that says, hey, this is a channel worth checking out, right? Till next time, I hope you guys have yourself. Oh yeah, close it off, right?